Hello, and welcome to Chapter 4 for Geography 101. And we've talked about population and resources, so now we're going to kind of move on to food, which is probably one of the most important resources that we have. So let's start at the very beginning, before time, before recorded history. Um, Humans were hunters and gatherers until about 10,000 years ago, and that means that, right, we did not have settled agriculture. That means that people basically lived off the land, as we saw in the video, The Great Human Odyssey. Now, this is something that a lot of us don't comprehend, but we've been a species for about roughly 100,000 years. There's been modern Homo sapiens. We've only been farming, right, until about 10,000 years ago. So, in fact, most of the time we've been a species, we've been hunters and gatherers. Farming or settled agriculture is a relatively new innovation. But, hunters and gatherers, right? Small, usually based on family, and took advantage of the landscape. So if it was summer and the fruit was ripe here, that's where they lived. And if it was fall and the fish were spawning over there, they'd walk over there. And so they were very mobile, and they didn't leave a large mark on the landscape, right? They weren't cutting down forests to farm. They weren't, damming rivers. But then we move into about roughly 10,000 years ago, settled agriculture. Now, settled agriculture just means this. Instead of following the food, people found a place where they could grow food on a regular basis, farming. As to why that happened, there's a lot of different theories. Um, it's not exactly definitively known why in many ways. But one thing that does happen is that with the improvements in agriculture, as we get better at farming and we start to design better tools, we could produce more food than hunter-gatherer societies in the same amount of land. And so what happens is, if you had the right combination of good soil and enough water, the amount of land required to feed one person, right, it shrinks. This is roughly, a hunter-gatherer needed this much land to support one person, where this much land was for two people, with a dry farmer, the earliest farming, and the most intensive agriculture can support up to three people in this little chunk. So what happens is it allows populations to just explode, explode. And in 1700s, in England at the time, this gentleman, Thomas Malthus, had this whole essay about, can population continue to grow indefinitely? In other words, is there a limit to how high our population can be? Because here was the issue that we had up until about the 1700s. Population increases geometrically. So one woman has three children. Each of those children has three children, so that's nine. So 1, 3, 9, 27, 120, and fast. So it's not a straight increase, right? But it's more that kind of upward curve. So population tends to increase that way. But when it comes to food, at a certain point, you maybe grow 4% more corn a year or 5%. It's a pretty steady increase. And so what happens is we lead to this issue where we start having more people than food. We outstrip the supply. And Malthus said that if that happens, several things will happen to counteract that, to control population: misery, poverty, and famine. So again, here is population. Population grows and grows and grows. But food or resources only grows at this rate. So when this point, when population grows more than there's enough food to feed, the Malthusian checks come into place. And this is really just a fancy word for saying famine, starvation, or conflict over resources, war. And the population declines to a point where now there is less people than resources, and so it grows. And so we have this kind of back and forth. But that this would always be a problem and a limit to natural resources. And that's the problem of geometric growth. That if you have too many people and not enough resources, you'd have famine or plague, because if you're not eating well enough, you get sick. War, because if you don't have resources and your neighbors do, that tends to lead to war, and then death. Now, it's very important to drink your coffee, to also notice that we have to put Malthus in his place. We have to look at his surroundings. And he was a social conservative in the 1800s, which is not even close to what conservatism is today. Let's put it that way. In the 1800s and the 1700s, especially in Great Britain and France, the main view was that you were responsible for your wealth or you're not. In other words, if you were poor, that was your fault. And there was also some thought that that could be hereditary, that those who were poor, the lower classes, just did not have the genetics, the ability to be rich or successful, and they would constantly be that way. And so social welfare felt that if we encouraged that, if we basically gave people aid at the bottom of the lever of ladders, right, the poorest of the poor, that would only encourage them to have more people, and it wouldn't solve the problem. If you keep on feeding the poor, they're going to keep on breeding, which sounds horrible, and it is. But that was the viewpoint of the time. So in their minds, the best way to reduce the burdens placed on the poor was to not encourage them to procreate. And in fact, there was so much worry about this, they had never really decided to count. In 1801, they counted in England how many people, they actually did a census and saw for the first time how many people were truly poor, and were shocked that it was a vast majority of the country. And how did they deal with this? So they passed laws. The new Poor Law of 1834 today would be not even considered. But this set up the first workhouses. If you were poor living in a city and you could not find work, you could not support yourself, you could go to the poorhouse where they would feed you and clothe you and give you a place to sleep, which sounds great, but it was also a workhouse. You had to work, and it was usually a factory setting, 15, 16 hours a day. Families were separated, men and women were separated. And the idea was to make this workhouse so horrible that you would only go there as a last resort, right? This whole thinking, by the way, later plays out in the idea of social Darwinism, in that those that are wealthy or have higher development, those countries, it's inherent survival of the fittest, that the poor are the poor because they can't compete. And that is actually a theory that has been tossed around, unfortunately. It's been used for many racist and nationalist theories as well. It's a strong component of Nazism, if you will. So another thing about Malthus we have to think about is the historical context. So we've talked about the demographic transition, where we now think that population levels off at a certain point. This period of time, most nations were only in the first two stages, where the death rate was beginning to come down, but population was just going up, up, up. So they had no context to think that maybe it might level off. What they saw was population exploding, and many of the people that were doing that were poor. It was also before what we're going to discuss is the agricultural revolution. This was kind of the companion to the industrial revolution, right? The manufacturing or the industrialization of food supply, which comes in hand with the industrial revolution. Now, we'll talk more about these in a little bit, but this leads Malthus to make some incorrect predictions, because the industrial and agricultural revolution allows us to dramatically increase the amount of food we are able to provide. And so the biggest thing I can think of is refrigeration. Imagine how long the food in your house would last if you did not have a refrigerator, right? That simple technology alone. What about canning? Having food in cans. They've actually found food at the South Pole that was left behind by explorers in 1915, 1920. And the cans are still intact. You can open them. The food is going to taste like crap, but it's not going to kill you. So canning, preserving, refrigeration, better sanitation, this alone has made agriculture much more productive, as we'll talk about. And so we've also seen that global population growth does tend to be leveling out. It's still increasing, but the demographic transition seems to be a reasonable explanation that it may not increase forever. And so Esther Bostrup was another scientist who said that in actuality, population growth is going to drive agricultural technology. The desire to feed people will be so strong that even though we may keep on increasing, we'll find more efficient and better ways to feed people. Okay. In other words, if you look at the history of population, right, food supply and population have always increased together. So we're going to pause right here for station identification, and we'll be back with part 2 after you get a cup of coffee and shake off the sillies.